Hello again, biology. We are going to be talking about part 3 of our notes, which looks at cellular respiration. And so we're looking at the second part of the unit that we want to talk about. So we covered photosynthesis in the 2 parts prior to this, and now we're going to be talking about the next process. The next process, which is a whole nother deal, a whole nother reaction, which is cellular respiration. Okay. All right. So what is it? So in cellular respiration, by the way, it happens in all organisms, not just plants, not just animals, not just in bacteria, but anything and everything that is living goes through cellular respiration. Okay. So right now, what we went through is we talked about what happens in photosynthesis. We are now in the second part of our overall, we looked at this reaction. Now we're going to be looking at this this reaction down here with cellular respiration. You'll notice that this makes a cycle, and that is, I'll show you how that works here in a minute. But we know from our photosynthesis reaction that we got sugar and we got oxygen gas out of it. And so that is going to be the starting point for cellular respiration. And the overall thing that happens in cellular respiration, that is the overall goal and thing that we focus on, is the ultimate end goal is making ATP. In cellular respiration, you'll notice we see the number 38. I'll talk about that later. So cellular respiration is where we take energy from glucose and we transfer it into energy in the form of ATP. So as you notice, ATP is coming back up. ATP is a really important molecule in any organic life form because it's the main source of energy that our bodies use and that our cells use. So what happens is that we take sugar and we use it to make this, to make ATP. Okay? And we have another equation for this, one that I again expect you to memorize, but oh well, wait, it's a little easier than you think, and it's a little more recognizable. It might seem familiar. This is where we take sugar, C6H12O6, glucose, and oxygen, and we react those together to make CO2, water, and some sort of energy. If we take a second, step back, and we go back to our very first slide about photosynthesis, you'll notice the equation for photosynthesis is the flipped version of the cellular respiration equation, or in other words, cellular respiration is the opposite reaction of photosynthesis. You'll notice that this stuff on this side is what we use what we start with in photosynthesis. And this is what we end with in photosynthesis. In cellular respiration, we're flipping the arrow around and we're taking the stuff that photosynthesis makes and we're making the stuff that we're getting rid of, or making the stuff that photosynthesis needs to start. Okay? This is important and goes back to this circular idea, in that we take the stuff that photosynthesis makes in cellular respiration, and cellular respiration makes the stuff that photosynthesis needs to start, minus the sunlight part. Okay, this is really important for how our environment works and regulates itself, and how life has kind of done this dance to exist on this planet for so long. So that's your equation you have to memorize. Sugar and oxygen makes CO2, water, and energy. Okay? So we actually have three types of cellular respiration. The first is aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen. It's also called oxidative respiration. The way that you can think about this aerobic, air sounds like the word air, A-I-R, like the air you breathe. So this is your type of respiration that needs air. It's aerobic. Okay? This type of respiration is broken up into three stages. Stage 1, glycolysis. Stage 2, the Krebs cycle. And stage 3, the electron transport chain. The ETC comes back, folks, in a different form. It comes back with a vengeance. We'll talk about each of these stages coming up here in more detail. But aerobic respiration is your first kind of respiration. Your second form of respiration is anaerobic. An is like anti-air, so anti-air. So this, based on the word, no air. So anaerobic does not require oxygen to happen. Okay, and then we have fermentation, which also does not require oxygen and does not use the electron transport chain. The only thing it uses is glycolysis. And so, like I said, we'll be talking about each of these stages in detail in a little bit. And there's two forms of fermentation. There's alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation, which you'll see after my box moves there. You'd have those two types. And we'll talk about each of those types here in a little bit too. So, all right. So this here is a diagram that goes over the first type of respiration, which is aerobic respiration, where we take our sugar and we put that through the three steps, or stages of that process to make ATP. Okay. So this one I might end up coming back to, but just this is the overview of what happens in aerobic respiration. And we start over here and we go to the right as we go. Okay, so let's look at each stage and what happens in each. So we're going to start out here with glycolysis. So I'm going to break up this word glycolysis here for you. Glyco refers to sugar. Lysis refers to breaking down of. So glycolysis or glycolysis has to do with the breakup of sugar. Okay? And so just like our word says, in this process, one glucose is broken down into two things called pyruvate. Okay? And when we do that, we do release some ATP when that reaction happens. Okay? So we get sugar, it breaks up into two pyruvate and two ATP. Okay? It says here that glycolysis actually produces 4 ATP, but it uses 2 of those ATP, so in general, we're just getting a gain of 2 out of this, okay? During this whole thing, I want to make sure you realize these 2 things here. That oxygen is not used in this stage, okay? Oxygen, even though this is part of aerobic respiration, glycolysis itself does not require oxygen to happen, okay? It does not use it. And glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of your cell. Okay, as it says here, it takes place outside the cell right here before we get to our power plant of the cell, which is the mitochondria. Okay, so glycolysis takes place out there, and that's stage 1. Remember, we're counting ATPs in this, so 2 ATP are made in glycolysis. We get 2 pyruvates out of it because we started with sugar. Okay, so we're done with here. Now we're moving on to our second and third steps. So notice it says up here that we have electrons carried via NADH. So this looks a lot like NADH plus or NADP plus. This is another molecule that just carries energy, and it carries it over into the mitochondria for later use. Okay, we'll come back to that when we get to part 3, stage 3. Part 2, stage 2, which is called the Krebs cycle. Okay, this happens in the mitochondria, and we're just going to take the pyruvate we made in stage 1 in glycolysis, and we're going to convert that into something called acetyl-CoA, and that enters into your Krebs cycle. Okay, and what happens is this acetyl-CoA is used to make NADH and FADH2. Again, these are just forms of energy, like molecules that help the next type of reaction happen. Okay? After these are made, acetyl-CoA is recreated then, and it puts it back into the Krebs cycle. Okay? CO2 is released at 2 points in the Krebs cycle, and overall the Krebs cycle makes 2 ATP. It takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. The matrix is the inner zigzag portion of the mitochondria, and I can maybe show that to you later. And again, no oxygen is needed for this step, but if it's not present, the cycle says I'm not even going to bother because we need oxygen for the last stage. Okay, but just know we don't use oxygen here, but it checks for it in order to start. Again, we're counting ATP, and we make 2 out of this. So here in this section, we go through all that craziness where we make NADH and FADH2, different molecules. We use acetyl-CoA here to get some ATP. Okay. All right. Then we have stage 3, which is called the electron transport chain. The ETC returns, like I said, with a vengeance in a different form. But electrons from our Krebs cycle, because they're being carried by these 2 molecules, travel down into the inner mitochondrial membrane. It's called the cristae. And then energy from those electrons is used to set up a concentration gradient of hydrogen ions across the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And then these are pumped out. Okay, that sounds complicated, but basically we're using electrons to make ATP, because these electrons and these H plus here are used as energy, okay? And we make up to 32 ATP in this. And I'll show you how that works here in a second. More parts of the ETC. Hydrogen ions diffuse from outer to inner compartments of the mitochondria through ATP synthase to make ATP. This process is called chemiosmosis, okay, or chemical osmosis. These hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen combine to make H2O, to make water, okay? And so the electron transport chain produces the most ATP with a whopping 32 per molecule of glucose, okay? Note, oxygen is needed in this stage. It is used, okay? And the way it's used is it's used as a kind of like a garbage man getting rid of the waste that we had. So these ions here that were not used up are carted away by being combined with oxygen to make water, okay? And this takes place on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, okay? So there's the electron transport chain. Since all this was a big thing to kind of go through, I'm just going to show you what happens in it. So the inner mitochondrial membrane is like these spaces in here. So, and what happens is, this is the inner membrane space, and this is the matrix, the inner part here. And so what happens is we have our NADH that was carrying electrons. It gets broken down into its lower form, and we use those. We take those H pluses, those electrons, and we pump them into the actual like inner membrane space. And those electrons are, brought through and used in ATP synthase here. When we're pumping in electrons as well, we're using just like waste hydrogen to make water here. And then we also use those here to make ATP from ADP. Okay. Again, this guy carries some energy, which gets pushed through all these proteins to make water and get rid of waste hydrogen here that no longer is in this form. This hydrogen here is useless, so that's why it gets rid of it by combining it with oxygen. We want this type of oxygen, which is H+, in other words, like free electrons, to go through and power ATP synthase. So again, the stuff that happens in the electron transport chain is we have our electron carrying molecules that get broken up. We yoink their electrons and push them through ATP synthase. If we have these used up hydrogens that get pushed out in the form of normal hydrogen, it is combined with oxygen and carted off as water. Okay, and this happens over and over and over again in this electron transport chain. Okay, And no, this is only when we have oxygen present. This only happens if we have an influx of oxygen because we need that oxygen to cart away this waste H2O that we don't need, or this waste H that we don't need. Okay? We get up to 36 ATP from this process alone, but only when oxygen is there. Okay? All right. So I'm going to stop there, I think, because this was just talking about aerobic respiration. I'm going to stop that, break it up so that you can absorb this separately from the other two types, which so are anaerobic types of respiration. So again, going through this real quick, we get in our first stage we have glycolysis, where we take sugar and break it down. We get pyruvate, 2 of them, and we get some ATP out of it. This pyruvate, along with some electron carriers, get transferred to the mitochondria. The electron carriers come in later. The pyruvate goes straight into the mitochondria. Remember, glycolysis takes place out in the cytoplasm of the cell. That pyruvate goes inside the mitochondria and goes through the Krebs cycle, which is several small reactions that end up breaking up that sugar further, that pyruvate further into more of these electron carrying molecules, and it makes some ATP out of it. Those electron carriers from the beginning and the second stage go into the electron transport chain to drive it along to yoink its extra energy to fuel ATP synthase. And any extra waste H, like hydrogen that we produce, is carted away by oxygen in the form of water. And that's where those two things come from. H2O is formed here in the electron transport chain. I believe we talked about here CO2 is made in stage 2 through taking acetyl-CoA and making these molecules. Okay, so that's where our 2 extra stuff come from. This process here of making ATP makes a lot of energy as well in the form of waste heat. And so, and making like water makes heat too. So that's where we get our 3 things from. We get carbon dioxide from stage 2, we get water from stage 3 along with heat. And ultimately we get a lot of ATP out, but only if we have oxygen. Okay? All right. So I'm going to stop there so you can go through that. If you need to mark on your sorry, on your handouts, you can. I'll show you what those look like here right now. Just give me a second to pause. Okay, so here are your handouts. So this shows glycolysis step by step, and I'll in more detail what's happening. So in glycolysis, we take sugar, turn it into 2 pyruvate and 2 ATP and 2 NADH. So the way it does that is it breaks those glucose up and it breaks it into 2 separate molecules, and this helps make NADH. and we get a release of energy from it in the form of ATP. And this is what our pyruvate are these 2,3 carbon molecules here. Okay. Something happens before we actually get to the Krebs cycle. And what that is that pyruvate is turned into acetyl-CoA and some carbon dioxide. So we go from this and we turn into this thing. Okay. And we get some more NADH from that and some CO2. In our actual Krebs cycle down here, acetyl-CoA is used to make our electron carriers, I should say H+. And another 2 ATP molecules. So as we kind of look at this cycle here, let's try and zoom out. What happens is we get our pyruvate, which goes in, and we get some CO2 out of it, and we make some more NADH from it to go to the electron transport chain. But that goes in, goes through some changes to make more of these molecules. As we do that, we make more CO2 and a little bit of ATP and more of those molecules. So overall, the Krebs cycle is all about making those energy molecules, and through those reactions we get CO2 and a little bit of ATP. Okay. And we get to the electron transport chain, which happens in our mitochondria space there, where we take our energy from our hydrogen ions, from our our molecules that were carrying them. We have low energy hydrogen, like I said, which is discarded, and that binds to oxygen, making water, and that's how we cart it off. And then our high energy hydrogen ions that are still left are used in ATP synthase to make ATP. So happens here in the inner membrane space. Okay, and this is what it looks like. This is just another version of the diagram that was on my slides. See, we'd have our energy carrying molecules that get broken up, and the electrons and a high energy hydrogen is brought in here to be used in ATP synthase, which makes heat. And then our leftover hydrogen that's used up gets paired with oxygen and carted away as water. Okay. Here's the overall diagram to show you what happens. But I've gone through that one a couple times already. So that is cellular respiration, specifically the aerobic kind. Okay? So I'm going to cut it off there. Let me know what questions you have. Make notes on your diagrams if you need to. It helps you out a lot. Okay? Alrighty. I'll talk to you all later and see you for the anaerobic types of respiration. Okay. Bye-bye.